When you hear of Japan, you think of the magnificent Mount Fuji, a vibrantly rich culture and an innovative society that's beating the rest of the world's, or so you think. Just like any country, Japan is not an ideal place to live. In fact, it's got a dark and sinister side that will shock you and open your eyes. If you watch to the end, you might never be able to see Japan the same way again. Life in this country is miserable for millions, and people are dying more and more, leading to a declining and depressed population. But before we talk about Japan's dark side, please make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. That way, you'll never miss another one of these eye-opening videos from us. Let's start from the beginning of the end, at least for Japan. The Japanese miracle. Following World War II, Japan was in ruins, both socially and economically. Whether it was losing family members, the nuclear attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, or the amount of money invested into a war that was ultimately lost, everyone felt the loss of the war in more ways than one, and the clock was ticking. Something had to change before Japan collapsed on its own. Beginning in the 1950s, the country implemented an aggressive growth strategy to bring its economy back on track. What you're about to hear came from the Japanese economist named Osamu Shimomura, known better as the father of the Japanese economic miracle. The Japanese government shook hands with giant corporate cartels and alliances, called the Keiretsu, to boost the local economy. The government not only accepted these mega corporations, but also funded them under the table, with enormous loans from the State Bank of Japan itself. This gave the Keiretsu the funds it needed to aggressively expand overseas and bring in export profits. On the other hand, the government blocked foreign companies from setting up in Japan to reduce their import spending, in return boosting the economy. As a result, in the 1980s, Japan was speedily emerging as an economic powerhouse, with a booming economy, a young and educated workforce, and hundreds of companies that were capturing the international markets. And so, these 3 golden decades were labeled the Japanese miracle, because it was nothing short of just that, a miracle. This superior system started creating anxiety in international waters, especially in America, which wasn't able to compete with Japan's newfound economic growth. Movies produced in these decades often portrayed the antagonists as Japanese companies taking over America. In Japan, the stock market was the best it's ever been. Employment rates were high, and every member of society was finally seeing the fruit of its hard labor. Some might have also called Japan an unstoppable force. But this was just the beginning of the birth of the lost generation. By the time the 1990s came around, Japan was already the second largest economy in the world, competing head-to-head with the United States itself. The economy was at its peak, and Japanese companies like Panasonic and Nissan were dominating international markets. But just like anything else, putting more and more pressure with no relief is a recipe for disaster, and that's exactly what happened with Japan. The Japanese economy went into overdrive, and economic decisions became more maniacal than logical. People started believing that there was an infinite return on any investment, and so money was circulating faster in the economy than it should have. Even the State Bank of Japan was printing more and more money and lending it out to anyone who showed up. This diluted the money's value, slowly but surely deeming the Japanese yen worthless. And in 1990, the stock market slashed itself by 43%. People lost all their money. Whatever they had was worthless because there was such an excess of printed currency going around. This shook confidence, and those who had managed to not lose their investments quickly pulled out and started holding on to cash as their only asset. Zombie companies were everywhere, and the never-ending supply of money meant that nothing held value. People also quickly realized how flawed the system was. Bribery, extortion, and fraud were more common than expected. This downfall of the Japanese economy impacted millions of people who are still trying to recover from it. Yes, I'm talking about a whole generation of Japanese youth, not just a few failed individuals. They are the lost generation of Japan. The Japanese work culture is also quite a strange one. You have one shot at getting a good job, and this is the moment you graduate from university. There is no second chance. Every fresh graduate goes through a corporate job hunting ritual named the Shushoka Katsudo, where you go through group interviews and seminars wearing specific black and white suits. If you survive the entire process, you get a job offer that begins the minute you graduate and offers you lifetime employment. Lifetime employment is a common concept that 99% of companies still implement in Japan today. With this, you are offered a lifetime guarantee of employment along with promotions within the same company, known as the Sanichoshin policy. Even if you decide you don't want to work at the company anymore, there is no escape, because no other company will hire you, regardless of your achievements or qualifications. So there is no choice, and you must get a corporate job once you graduate and hold on to it till you retire. If you don't, every door will close on you, and you will live your entire life between temporary part-time jobs that don't pay enough. Now back to the lost generation. When the economy went down, so did these job-hunting rituals and the promises of lifetime employment. Companies stopped hiring fresh graduates and only focused on their current employees, leaving millions of fresh graduates out on the street without a job or prospects. Eventually, companies went back to their old hiring practices. But those who graduated throughout the 1990s were overlooked, since they weren't technically fresh graduates anymore. And so a whole generation of millions of talented Japanese men and women fell through the cracks, being forcefully resigned to a life of low-paying jobs and financial dependence. This era is also known as the Employment Ice Age. You'll be surprised to hear this, but it wasn't just the 1990s generation who are part of the lost generation. It also includes millions of those who graduated during the 2000s and the 2010s. The Japanese decline. The country never fully recovered from the economic collapse of 1990, and the effects of that have seeped into every aspect of Japanese life. You already know how horrible the work culture is, but wait till I tell you it gets worse. The lost generation is still incapable of making good money, and they're only in their 30s and 40s as we speak. Depending on their families for financial support, the lost generation is Japan's wasted potential that could have bolstered the economy back to the golden days. Today, they make up 15% of the country's population at around 17 million people. These people were robbed of their future lives and never got to marry, have children, buy a house or a car, or even start their own business to survive, since they had no money to support these basic dreams. Because of their inability to marry or start a family, Japan now has the world's most aging population, with 30% of its population being 65 years or older. These people often have little to contribute to society, making it harder for the economy to get back on its feet again. However, those who manage to not fall through with the lost generation don't have it much better either. Beginning in the 1920s, the country went through rapid industrialization, which resulted in the concept of being a loyal and dedicated worker circulating throughout the society. You had to be more dedicated to your job than to your family. And so, with lifetime employment came unbearable work expectations. Every employee is trapped under mounds of unrealistic expectations and burdens. For instance, you have to stay beyond regular hours and take unpaid overtime, creating a toxic level of stress, exhaustion, and mental sickness in the workplace. In fact, exhaustion and fatigue are so prevalent in every single job that you'll find people in nice, three-piece suits passed out in the middle of the street because they're too tired to make it home. Family life is similarly disturbed by this stress, as it rewires the human body to prevent reproduction when either of the partners is stressed. Again, this is contributing to Japan's aging population. Perhaps the worst of it all, for both the lost generation and otherwise, is the isolation. Despite being a subject that's regularly talked about, little is done to rectify the sense of isolation so many Japanese people feel in their country. From the outside, Japanese culture might look rich, philosophical, and without flaw. However, today there is little sense of community within this country. Strong bonds between individuals, whether that is your family, neighbors, or friends are few and far between. The result? Complete social isolation. We humans are social animals, and our brain processes social needs the same as hunger. But when you cut out all social aspects of life from a person, you get hikikomori. This concept refers to individuals, often young adults, who voluntarily isolate themselves from society, withdrawing from social interactions and confining themselves to their homes for extended periods. The prevalence of hikikomori raises questions about the societal pressures and expectations placed on Japan's people, particularly in the context of its competitive academic environment and rigid work culture. This phenomenon is seen by some as a response to intense societal demands, such as academic performance expectations and employment pressures. In a society that places forced emphasis on conformity and success, hikikomori is nothing but a psychological response to these pressures. The hikikomori people not only seclude themselves from their families, but also from any social interactions, even those online. This is seriously damaging their well-being, and psychologically, it might be impossible to reverse. These folks will resort to having video game girlfriends and go through severe depression without any medical aid. Add the stressful work culture to this social isolation, and it's no surprise that Japan has a high suicide rate. In fact, the Aokigahara forest is more popularly known as the suicide forest, one of the most used locations in the world for people to take their own life. However, Japanese culture doesn't have as strong a taboo on suicide as many other countries, going as far as to consider some types of suicide an honorable death. Even from a historical standpoint, the culturally sanctioned suicide named seppuku is one of the most respected forms of death. And this brings us to the end of the video. If our video on Japan's sinister truths has you shocked, make sure you leave a like and subscribe. That way we'll book you a passenger seat on our upcoming video travels. In the meantime, check out this cool video right here.